Opening slide, graphic text. Focus on the good things of life. Title: Exploring the Limitations of Paid Supports. Image of John Armstrong. Logos, Belonging Matters, and TalksThatMatter.net.
Well, thank you, Carmen, and everyone coming in to have a listen to this interesting topic. Just to give you some context for this, this topic was just one of the very short modules in a 10-day workshop with 5 evening sessions that Wolfensberger conducted in Australia back in 1997. It's the most amazing workshop, and he only ever taught it once, and he said it was probably the best workshop that he ever had in terms of audience response. And it did incorporate some previous older material updated from the planning workshop as well as from the moral coherency workshop. There's a kind of combination of those things, and within it was this topic. And in fact, I got to present this topic because he handed out modules to various people in Australia, about 4 or 5 of us, and this topic was one that I had to present. So, and it was such an interesting analysis that we'd never seen anyone else do in terms of the limitations of the paid role. And the reason why, in some ways, this is important is to also put human services in a bit of a context, because there was a time in human history when there weren't any human services. There weren't even schools, would you believe? A school itself as a human service that didn't come into being until about the 16th century, and especially where we wanted kids to learn to read, and we wanted kids not to know what adults knew, and we needed to separate kids from that. And one way was through reading, and of course then as they matured, they got to know what adults knew about all sorts of things. And so prior to that, there were no schools. This is why kids went to work and coal mines and all of those sorts of things. And then when school came along, it actually differentiated children from adults, because there was a time when kids were just treated as little adults, and there weren't any specific ways of protecting them. In fact, I think the history, it was at 1810 was I might have to check that date, but I do recall that the Society for the Protection of Animals started 10 years before the Society for the Protection of Children. And anything you could do to an adult, you could do to a child, including hanging them. And there were all sorts of accounts of people being arrested and hung, including 10-year-old children. And so even now we still have the debate on when can we accuse a child of a crime and those sorts of things. Anyway, that goes off a little bit track. Just to say, though, that with the advent of paid human service, it brought about some changes in the way we looked at service in general. Because even prior to that, people were either supported in their communities, and then later they were supported within many church settings. The church was often the center of town, and you might notice if you visited Europe and England, the churches are in the center, and people got buried around the church, and the graveyard is always there. But also people were cared for within the church. They lived inside the church. And interestingly, some of the history associated with now hospitals and where nurses sit is very similar, and came from the practice of anyone in a church could always see the altar. And then when hospitals came along, it was the nursing station that replaced the altar. Things like that. Just to let you know, if you don't already know, you're not going to be able to see that very clearly. Let me take one out of there is a 5 DVD set that you can purchase online on the history of human services. Now, some of these are in downloadable form as well. So I've got the set of 5. I have a cover for this, but I don't know, I can't find the cover. And it's essentially a 2-day workshop that Wolf and Susan Thomas ran on the history of human services. And it's filled with pictorial examples. And it's absolutely fascinating. So it goes basically from the Romans to the present. And many of the things we do today have these very long connections to what was done in the past. As I just said about, where did the nursing station come from? And the idea too that the nurse should be able to basically observe everybody. Well, now we observe people with monitors and things like that can also be accessed often in a nursing station, especially in the intensive care, those kind of things. Now, since World War II, not much prior to that, essentially the institution, and if you wanted to keep a son and daughter at home, you're on your own. So we had the institutions that existed for some hundreds of years, but after World War II, and those institutions got a huge burst around the turn of the century, from the 1900s from 1901 and that period in the 20th century, because of the IQ test, social Darwinism, the rise of eugenics. And so the institutions just burgeoned with people that were seen as tainted in some way in their genetic makeup, and therefore had to be kept from breeding and infiltrating the rest of the population. But then World War II came, and there was a change in attitude, of course, towards the institution, and people started to want to keep sons and daughters at home. But also we saw a change in the economy. Prior to World War II, much of the economy was primary and secondary production, with a little bit associated with service, but service was about 4% of the economic activity. After World War II, that started to reverse itself completely. And so that we had the rise of service and all sorts of service, tourism, hospitality, hotels, restaurants, those kind of things. And then, and of course, services to other people and other devalued people as well. So the rise of the nursing home, and now vast amounts of nursing homes, and barely find enough people to support them. And of course, the disability services, as they became now community-based, then a reliance on a workforce that existed within community settings, and even within people's homes. And what came with that, of course, was this expectation that that the service should be paid. And so when we think now of the NDIS and being seen as eligible, it implies that I'm eligible for money, and the money will be used sometimes for equipment and things like that, but also to pay someone to do something. And so the idea that paid people now is part and parcel, and an almost guaranteed expectation that I need staff. And whereas that wasn't necessarily the case in the past, when people were served in hospital settings, in the churches, that was voluntary. They were volunteers. In fact, St. Vincent's de Paul used to train the people who would, meet the needs of people, I suppose, giving them food and shelter and perhaps assistance with washing and clothing, and was that they were to apologize, because he understood that when you serve someone, you're the one who gets the benefit from it. You're the one who gets the brownie points, and by serving someone else, the recipient actually has certain needs met, but the real winner here is the person giving the service, in a sense. And he would say, you better say sorry to these people because of what you're getting from this process of serving them. And so this post-World War II, what Wolf calls the post-primary production economy, was a change where service now occupies the greater triangle, with secondary production and primary production up there. Now they're the 4%, and this vast burgeoning population of people to provide service. And one of the reasons I think they're wanting to increase our immigration levels, basically to get people who are going to be support workers in nursing homes and the like. Another author who writes about these themes, about, you might say, the professionalization, the formalization of service, is John McKnight. And this is my favorite book. He's got several books you can get, but this is my favorite book. It's The Careless Society. And it's actually a book of his major articles. And he has several chapters here. And one of my very favorite chapters is John Deere and the bereavement counselor, and where he likens you think John Deere, he invented a plow, a plow that was able to get into the deep soils of the Midwest in America and down south and turn that sod. And it went on to result in the Great Dust Bowl that you might recall from history around the time of the Great Depression. And basically, he compares this invention that creates a dust bowl with human services and the professionalization of people's needs that used to especially be met by our relationship with each other. And so he talks about the grievance counselor, so some tragedy has occurred, a child has been killed in high school, and the grievance counselors now are called upon to come and fix all of this and help us through the trauma, where once upon a time we got together and we sorted that out together. So he is a very interesting read about that. And also the prime person who went on to develop asset-based community development, otherwise known as ABCD. And occasionally you'll see in Australia ABCD workshops held that helps people particularly identify the strengths within their community. Now, Wolf in this workshop then developed a bit of an analysis of what happens then when people are supported by people who are paid to meet their needs, and some intrinsic shortcomings that come with that. And this is when service is good. This is when you've got a good person, a good worker. He's saying there are some intrinsic limitations that simply come when a person is paid to provide that support. And the first one is, of course, is that some valued roles don't have a valued counterpart when it's paid. So, for instance, if you wanted or needed a spouse in your life, that's one of the roles that you can't have that looks quite as valued when you pay for it. Although spouses can be expensive from time to time, you get what I mean. There isn't a counterpart. And that's important for SRV because in our service arrangements, we often search for what is a valued activity in the community that acts as a parallel for what we're trying to do here. And this is basically saying in some roles, you can't find a valued counterpart for that. There isn't one. And one that occurs a lot here is the idea that I might be someone's friend. Is a little bit closer to the mark than the idea of a spouse. We don't get too many requests for spouse, but friends, the expectation that this worker might be my friend is a very common expectation and assumption based upon it, as opposed to being friendly. I can be friendly, but can I be your friend? And it's actually a contradiction to that role to be paid to be that. And in that sense, so that's an aspect. So that's the first thing, that there's a limitation on how this might look. And does it look like a role that we recognize? But hang on, when you're paid, it acts as a limitation to certain roles. So that's just part of the reality of that. The second one is that the whole idea of being caring is something that can only come from the heart. You can't dictate an attitude because you pay for it. And it's like, and again, McKnight writes about this idea that agencies now describe themselves as being caring. And yet, hang on, you're paid. And I came across this, I have a couple of hearing aids and I get tested from time to time. And so let me just go back. And I got this, I have this, and you might notice that they have Better Life Hearing Service. We care. Yeah, as long as I pay for the hearing aid, they care a lot and they're nice. They're just normatively nice and trying to be helpful, but caring is a level, it's almost suggesting we love. because that's where care exists. It exists in the context of love. And you can't buy me love. The Beatles knew that. And so this idea that, so we can't induce this level of caring. You might say, if I pay you more, now will you love me? It just doesn't work that way. And so that's interesting. And yet there's a second little item in here, is that some types of service you would hope come with a deep caring and a deep respect, even a love and a bodily care, a deep sense of reverence and love. Otherwise, it just gets abusive. And it's because it's such an intrusion, perhaps, to a person's personal space. And that if caring and even love wasn't present, then of course, and all the time we hear of people being abused, and partly because we think, well, we've paid people, they should be caring. And it just, that doesn't equate. That's not how you get caring to occur, because caring is voluntary, right? It has to be something I submit myself to, not because my arm is being twisted through payment. So at the end, if you have any questions about this, certainly bring them back, and I can clarify anything that might not sound right to you. So paid service then, even at its best, will be required to do several things. And one of those things is to do things that the person doesn't need. And that often comes because there are needs of other parties. And we have, for instance, the needs of accountability through the NDIS and the amount of paperwork that has to be fulfilled, even to the extent that the paperwork now is interfering with the level of support. And that's growing. And such that, in any particular shift, a worker may spend half of that shift on their computer, filling out all the form work that's required. Now, the person themselves doesn't need that. It makes no iota of difference to what the person receives. And so stuff is happening here from their perspective isn't needed or necessary. And often it comes because of the needs of a third party that controls the nature of the relationship. And they may even be prevented from doing things that are needed. I know the situation of a woman with an intellectual disability who's had a baby. And so she needs some support, as many mothers do anyway, in looking after a newborn. It's a pretty big, sudden thing, this extra baby who's totally dependent on the care that they receive. But the funding only goes to the mother. And so the worker refuses to do anything in association with the baby because only the mother is funded, not the baby. So isn't that interesting? And so this relationship needs help and nurturing, and for someone to look after them. And it's just not there because the funding's not for her. It's only for this party. So silly things like that, isn't it? And yet you'd think the support would be to help her into her new valued role of mother. The next item is that the needs of the server can clash with the needs of the recipient. And we touched on this a little earlier. It's about the independence. So you might say there can be a conflict in the interests of different people. Different people come into a service arrangements for different reasons, and they might have an interest in getting something out of this arrangement. And sometimes that interest clashes with the interest of the person receiving the service. Now, that can occur in freely given relationships as well, but it's less likely when money is not involved. But once money becomes involved, then there's a clear interest in that. And that might mean, therefore, that the need of this person, when they do it, what they do, and so on, competes with the needs of the party who's receiving the assistance. And what we find is that quite often the recipient's needs are sacrificed. And the story before about the house being closed down and all of that business, we saw some of this in that particular encounter where the people's needs were being prepared to be sacrificed except someone stood up for those needs and insisted. So quite often for pragmatic or expediency reasons, we see this kind of thing, or to keep my job or to have prestige. And therefore, I don't want to do this in a way that meets your needs. I want to do it in a way that suits me. Another one is that paid workers tend to come and go. They don't last forever. Their relationships also tend to be closed. They're limited. And this is what it's about. When you meet someone in a freely given relationship, it might be just a casual acquaintance. It might be a bit of a chat and a contact and so on. It might become a bit regular. It might become a deep friendship. Who knows? In that sense, an unpaid relationship is open-ended. It has many possibilities as to what it might grow into and become. But in this arrangement, in a paid arrangement, it's closed off, and that's limited. And it's also limited that, in a sense, the service provider is giving a service, nothing else is needed back from that person, something we'll return to in a little moment. And the other feature here that's being picked up on is a procession of people. I don't know if some of you have follow the Facebook page for the Citizen Advocacy Trust. And I write there, we're in a series on the wounds of people. And one of them, of course, was physical and social discontinuity. That is the passage of people through people's lives and the impact that can have, where in the end, people don't know how to have a relationship. They've always been used to people leaving them, and may even precipitate that by rejecting this new party first, thinking that this person's inevitably going to go just like everybody else has. And so are deeply affected by that procession. If they're only being surrounded by paid relationships, they actually often don't know how to conduct a friendship, and they don't know what it entails. I have a friend who's a citizen advocate, for this woman, and even when my friend moved interstate, she would fly down to accompany this lady to various appointments and even to court and things like that. They'd been together for 18 years. And this woman happened to say one day, you know, how much are you paid for this? And she couldn't conceive that my friend had never been paid for this role. It was simply outside of her experience, and she found it hard to even conceive of such a thing. She so imagined that my friend would be always paid because anybody else associated with her had always been paid. And interestingly, there are some competencies that are better acquired and learned in the context of freely given relationships, and the experiences that come from them and how to learn from that. And of course, if a person has grown up in a natural family, they've acquired many of the competencies associated with, you know, sharing and taking turns and waiting your turn, and also contributing to everybody else, to actually contribute. If that's not been the case, then their primary roles are often very, well, they're non-existent, and it's very hard for them to build upon that. And so these competencies about how to relate to other people, how to be agreeable, in a sense, may not have been learned and can't be acquired unless one is in a freely given relationship. Now, we're not suggesting here that people should never have paid support. That's not the conclusion we're making, but we are saying there are certain needs that are harder to meet if a person doesn't at least have some freely given relationships. That's the issue. The reliance on paid relationships alone is going to leave people very short of the experiences they need to be a fully rounded human being and to have the fuller range of experiences that usually come with that. Everyone being paid to relate to me is a very odd situation indeed. It also, though, helps us to target then, if a person is to get paid support, How might that person work in order to protect and honor and show respect to freely given relationships, even to behave in a way that nurtures them, knowing that they are so valuable? So that almost changes the role definition for a paid worker, to learn to be able to bring other unpaid people into the life of someone and to encourage their involvement rather than to take over and surround the person totally, keeping everybody else at bay. And so there are lots of competencies. I think I've been through most of them. And they're interactional, aren't they, in nature? How do we interact with each other? But in a paid role, I'm a recipient. I'm not here to interact. And I'm not here to give back to anyone. I'm just a receiver. And so the whole experience of giving is missing out on. And the last point exemplifies that: the need for service recipients to contribute and not just receive can more easily be met in freely given relationships. Freely given relationships are reciprocal. And a gentleman I met in L'Arche told me that basically any relationship that isn't reciprocal is destined to fail. And so that's very interesting, that even people with very severe disabilities need relationships that allow for some degree of reciprocity within them. And not everybody can reciprocate that well and easily. Sometimes we match citizen advocates to people who are known to be non-reciprocal, because they are people who can be most easily rejected and some of the most devalued people there are, because it's thought that they're incapable of giving anything back. And I speak with some of those advocates sometimes, and they tell me, yeah, but I know that he knows when I arrive. I can tell that he knows that I'm there, and he's really glad to see me. Now, no one else can perceive that, but the advocate can. And so even there, you see a degree of reciprocity occurring in this relationship that sustains the actions of the advocate and their commitment to this person. And it's more blessed to give than to receive, as they say. And that's what this one's picking up on. In a paid role, there are even policies that prohibit staff accepting anything from someone they're supporting, a card or a small gift or thanks or a birthday. All of those things are often, in many agencies, are prohibited. You're not to accept anything. And so the person never gets to be placed in a position where anyone else wants anything from them. Just imagine that. And yet we know it's our ability to give to others that brings us often the greatest joy in the world. And so that completes our rundown of Wolf's analysis of the intrinsic limitations of paid services.
Closing slide graphic text with thanks to John Armstrong. Web address johnarmstrong.media. This video was made possible with the support of an information and capacity building grant through the Department of Social Services. Produced by Belonging Matters. Belonging Matters makes every effort to provide accurate and up-to-date material. However, information is subject to change and our materials for reference only. This video was produced on the land of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung and Ngunnawal people. Logos, Belonging Matters and TalksThatMatter.net.